So now we have the fort surrounded and we're pouring a very heavy fire into it. And Clark sends a message to Hamilton inside the fort, and he requests the surrender of the fort. Hamilton responds essentially that he'll do no such dishonorable thing as a British officer. And as soon as Clark gets word on this, he recommences the attack. So throughout the night, we're firing incessantly at the fort. We're not inflicting many casualties anymore because the British have learned that they can't expose themselves. But we keep up the fire through the night. And then in the morning, so now this is the morning of February 24th, we were finally fed a breakfast that was graciously provided us by the local friendly French townspeople there at Vincennes. So it was the first time we had eaten anything substantive in 6 days. So the men are now refreshed. It's daylight. We're still continuing to fire on the fort. The Willing, by the way, has not showed up, as you can imagine, trying to navigate its way through all those flooded rivers. It didn't show up in time. And we start thinking about how are we going to get inside this fort. Hamilton did not know our strength, but we did. And we knew that we had nowhere near the number of men that we needed to storm that fort. So we started talking about undermining the fort by tunneling underneath the walls and then using gunpowder to blow down one of the walls so that we could get inside of it. And as we were discussing various options for how we were going to take control of this fort, what came crashing out of the woods towards the fort but a party of Indians that had just returned fresh from a raid in Kentucky. And they had the bloody scalps dangling from their hands. And we knew they were coming because remember when I was telling you about the grandeur of the Wabash, the son of tobacco? Well, he was the chief of the Piankashaw, and this village that I mentioned before, Chippewa, that was outside of the town of Vincennes there, was one of his villages. So they knew that this raiding party was coming back in order to exchange their bloody scalps at Fort Sackville for their trade goods. And the grandeur alerted us that they were coming. So we were waiting in ambush for them. And the normal procedure when these Indians came in is once they came out of the woods, they would fire their guns in the air in order to announce their approach. And people from inside the fort would come out to meet them, and they would likewise fire their guns in the air. Now these Indians had no idea that we were there. So as they came out of the woods, they're yelling their war whoops and they're firing their guns in the air. And Clark sent a detachment of our men out to meet them. And he told them, you go out and you act just like you're coming from the fort, and you hold your guns in the air and you yell war whoops, except don't fire your guns until you have made sure that every single one of those Indians has fired his gun, and then you lower yours and you fire at them. So the Indians come out of the woods and they've got their guns in the air and they're yelling and whooping and firing their guns, and our men are yelling and whooping, except we're not firing our guns. And once we made sure that they had all fired theirs and were now empty, we lower ours and we fire at the Indians. And we managed to kill 2 of them on the spot. We wounded many others of them, and we captured 6 of them. There are about 20 in this party. We captured 6 of them, including their chief. As it turns out, we later found out that all of the Indians that we had shot ended up dying except one. Only one of them ever made it back to his village. The rest of them made it back into the woods and died somewhere after that. But we had 6 prisoners now, and now Clark had a plan for how we were going to get into that fort. So we took those prisoners to the main street right outside the fort, in full view of the fort, but far enough away so that they couldn't engage us with musket fire from the fort. Upon doing that, we found out that 2 of them were actually Kentuckians who had been captured and taken prisoner. So we freed them, so now we have 4 Indians left, including their chief. And we knelt them down in full view of the fort in the main street, and one by one we proceeded to tomahawk them to death. We took our tomahawks out, and we just went down the line, and one by one we would just bury the tomahawk in their head until we killed them. And then we took their dead bodies and we dragged them over to the river and we threw them in the Wabash and let them float away. Now Henry Hamilton is watching this, and now he wants to talk to Clark. So he sends a message out to Clark and requests that they meet in order to discuss possible terms of surrender. And he told Clark that if he didn't feel comfortable doing this in the fort, that he would come out and meet him in the church at town. So that was what Clark agreed to do. They met at the church, and Henry Hamilton proposed his terms for surrender, and Clark rejected them. Now keep in mind, again, the whole purpose of this was to secure the surrender of the fort without us having to storm it, because we couldn't, at least until the Willing arrived. So here's Hamilton offering to surrender the fort, and Clark refuses it. And Hamilton asks him, why are you refusing? And Clark says, because I want to be free to execute the people who are responsible for the murder of the people of Kentucky. And until you surrender unconditionally, purely on my terms, I'm not willing to accept it. So with that, one of Hamilton's lieutenants literally turns white and starts shaking, because he knows that he's one of the people that Clark plans to execute. And Hamilton confers with his officers, and finally he agrees to surrender unconditionally. And Clark actually gave him very generous terms, that he would surrender the fort at 10 o'clock the following morning on the 25th of February. We would take possession of the fort. We would take possession of the British soldiers in their arms, and most of them would just be paroled on the spot, because again, we had no capacity to take that many prisoners. But what we did do is take Henry Hamilton prisoner. So Hamilton goes back inside the fort, and we go back to our stations outside the fort. And Hamilton had a tradition that every morning they would fire off the morning gun, the post cannon. They'd fire off the morning gun and raise the colors up the flagpole. That particular morning, Hamilton did not raise the flag up the pole, because he didn't want to have to suffer the disgrace of having to strike his colors later on in that day. So he never ran his colors up the pole that day. And true to his word, at 10 o'clock, the gates of the fort open up, and we had our men stationed on either side of the gate. And Hamilton walks out of the gate. And the normal manner of surrendering in my time was the surrendering officer would draw his sword from his scabbard, and he would present it to the conquering officer and surrender. And the conquering officer would generally take the sword ceremonially and then hand it back to the surrendering officer and say something like, "Never from so fine a hand," and he would get his sword back as a show of honor. When Hamilton comes out and he surrenders his sword to Clark, he for the first time sees how few men we really have. And he very nervously looks around, thinking that he has been lured into some kind of trap, and that they're perhaps going to be slaughtered once they get outside the fort. So when he surrenders his sword to Clark, he very nervously says to him, "Sir, where is your army?" And Clark smiles and he looks at him and he says, "Sir, my army stands before you." And at that moment, Hamilton realized that he had been duped. But he had agreed to surrender the fort. Our men were already inside it now, so there was no going back. And that was how we recaptured Fort Sackville. And up till this point in time, by the way, I would like to mention that we did not lose a single man. From the time we left Fort Pitt all the way down the Ohio River to the Falls of the Ohio, from the time we went ashore at Fort Massac and captured Kaskaskia and captured Cahokia, and then did this absolutely insane march all the way across flooded Illinois to Vincennes, we did not lose a single man, either to enemy action or to disease or to the elements. It was absolutely incredible. So we are now back in control of Fort Sackville, and the ultimate goal is to take Detroit. But we were never able to do that, because by this time the revolution had moved into the southern colonies, and the West no longer made any difference to anybody. The American political leaders were no longer willing to support the war in the West, because they needed all of their troops back in the East. In fact, none other than Patrick Henry himself, who is no longer governor of Virginia, he's been succeeded now by Thomas Jefferson, but Patrick Henry, who was the one who authorized the Illinois campaign in the first place, was one of the leading advocates against giving Clark any more reinforcements to take Detroit, because Richmond had, at the meantime, it was under threat of attack. It hadn't been sacked yet, but it was under threat, and they now realized that they needed to keep their troops home, and they weren't willing to send Clark any more men. So Clark was never able to take Detroit, but he really didn't need to, because Detroit came to him in the form of Henry Hamilton. So now we had possession of Kaskaskia and Cahokia on the Mississippi River. We had liaison with the Spanish in St. Louis. We had effectively treated with many of the previously hostile Indian tribes to get them to stop raiding Kentucky. We were back in control of Vincennes, and we had captured the British military governor of Detroit. And that is essentially how the war ends. From that point on, the Illinois Regiment engaged in small-scale reprisals against the Indians. Some of the Indians, particularly the Shawnee, who lived here north of the Ohio River, would continue to raid into Kentucky, and the Illinois Regiment would then launch reprisals against them in their towns like Chillicothe and Piqua. We had also established a fort named Fort Jefferson at the mouth of the Ohio here, where it flows into the Mississippi, but we weren't able to maintain that, and we had to relinquish that after a very short amount of time. And that essentially is how the war ends, with us in control of Cahokia, Kaskaskia, and Vincennes. So now the American political leadership starts negotiating the end of the war with the British. This is 1783 now. Cornwallis has lost at Yorktown, the last major battle of the Revolution. And 2 years after that, we are now meeting in Paris to negotiate the treaty that would officially end the American Revolution. And all the warring parties are involved in these treaty negotiations. And we claim, as part of the peace agreement, we claim the entirety of the Northwest Territory. And again, that is all of modern-day Illinois, all of modern-day Indiana, all of modern-day Ohio, all of modern-day Michigan, including the Upper Peninsula, all of modern-day Wisconsin, and this portion of northeastern Minnesota. We claim all of that for the United States of America, purely on the basis of 150 Virginians being in control of these three tiny little outposts down here in the far southwest area of this region: Cahokia, Kaskaskia, and Vincennes. And the British, for reasons that I won't get into here, but the British decided it's in their best interest to cede that to the United States. And that is how that entire region came to be part of the United States of America. If it hadn't been for the conquest of the Northwest Territory by the Illinois Regiment, had the campaign never been undertaken, or had we been defeated, this entire region would have remained part of British North America at the conclusion of the Revolution, which means that in your modern times, everybody who lives in this region would be Canadian. The only reason that any of you who live in the upper Midwest here are Americans today is because of George Rogers Clark and the men of the Illinois Regiment.